So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us at Secular AZ. Again, feel free to put your name in the chat, in the webinar, on Facebook. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state. We've been doing it for over a decade. We have some incredible programming, including our Friday updates from all kinds of amazing speakers, journalists, historians, authors, elected officials, you name it. Next Friday, I'm so excited. I feel like I fangirl a lot at these discussions because we have so many amazing speakers, including today's speaker. But next Friday, we're going to be speaking with Rabbi Mike Harvey. He's the author of Let's Talk, A Rabbi Speaks to Christians, and he's going to join us to discuss indoctrination, religious hypocrisy, and more. And we're going to continue to have these discussions. And by the way, both Chrissy Stroop, who's joining us today, and Rabbi Mike, and actually all of the speakers we've had, if you are on Twitter, you definitely want to follow their Twitters because I'm entertained all the time. And I honestly don't even know how they put up with the trolls, but they do, and they do it in a really smart and clever way. So I would recommend following all of their accounts. So yeah, we're going to continue this series about abuse that's happening in some religious organizations with some great speakers. And I hope that you'll support the work that we do. If you like this kind of stuff, we need help, whether it is becoming a recurring donor to support our work at the legislature, at school boards, with our action alerts, with our legal complaints, or if you want to get more involved as a volunteer, we have all kinds of opportunities for you. So please consider becoming a member. I do know that last night from the Peoria Unified School District Board meeting, somebody posted on Twitter that they became a member because of last night. So we do good work. But today, I am super excited. This is at least your second time with me here, but Chrissy Stroop is joining us today. Chrissy is the author of Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church, and a prolific writer-researcher whose work appears on Religion Dispatch, The Conversationalist, Open Democracy, and more. And I know that you have a much more extensive resume than that, Chrissy. So please, if there's anything that you're currently working on, or if there's something I missed, please feel free to go ahead and let us know about that.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeannie, for that warm introduction. It's always a pleasure to join you. And in terms of other things that I've written, I just think it's kind of funny. The first time I wrote about the Southern Baptists, who we'll be spending some time talking about today, it was for Playboy magazine. Online only, though. But yeah, so today I'm grateful to have the invitation and to be able to join you to participate in this series about who's grooming who, and abuse and Christian nationalism and all that sort of stuff. Many of you are probably aware that I grew up evangelical and very much Christian right. Went to Christian schools almost all of K through 12, with the exception of kindergarten and half of sixth grade, because there was an interstate move in there, which is a whole story in itself, because we moved to Colorado Springs right when it was becoming, what Colorado Springs is now, sort of, and evangelical center, but center is not a strong enough word. I mean, Focus on the Family just moved there from Southern California, so that was something. Long story short, bad blood between authoritarian pastor and his subordinates meant that my dad, who was the music pastor and the youth pastor, ended up moving back to Indiana, where I'm from, so we didn't stay there too long. And yeah, anyway, one of the things that it was kind of shocking to me to learn as an adult, initially shocking, and then of course still very saddening, is that when I was a kid in these evangelical spaces, churches and Christian schools and summer camps, and there was all kinds of abuse going on around me all the time. As an adult, people have shared their stories with me. I've learned a little bit more about what was going on. And I was never sexually abused myself. I was spanked sometimes with a wooden spoon and subject to a lot of manipulation, controlling tactics, things that you could call psychological or spiritual abuse. But as an adult, I've really tried to take a step back and put things in social context using social theory, social psychology, cognitive science, my own study of history, in which I have a PhD, sociology, and try to just contextualize what the hell is going on in these conservative Christian communities. They're very authoritarian communities, with this kind of strict hierarchical structure. And today we're going to talk about why those kinds of structures and realities do tend to create an environment where abuse proliferates. I do want to stress that abuse can happen in any environment, and it's not exclusive to these institutions, but there are both attitudes and habits of mind and best practices, and that's very important, that can help to prevent abuse. And for ideological reasons, people in conservative communities, often conservative religious communities, tend to reject those things, and it leads to abuse just like you would expect it to. And some of that abuse is outright prescribed. I mean, spare the rod and spoil the child, I'm sure you all know the Bible verse, is very much applied in these communities. So there's a lot of hitting children, often with objects. But anyway, before I get too far off track, let me just pull up my slides here, do the screen sharing thing, and I'll start the slide presentation. And while I'm doing that, feel free to put your questions in the chat as they may come up, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. I'll try not to spend an undue amount of time on the slide presentation, but I just want to lay out a few fundamental points. And honestly, having slides helps keep me on track, because I am the kind of person who can ramble and go down rabbit trails. So it's partly just about giving some sort of structure to this talk. So things I want to address today is how hierarchy and indoctrination actually can be a kind of grooming, and certainly contribute to grooming of people for abuse. And these attitudes and habits and social practices help to explain why abuse proliferates in conservative and Christian institutions. I'm going to be drawing a lot on moral foundations theory and cognitive science, particularly around framing and language. George Lakoff, who is retired from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, did a lot of work on how the way that we frame certain concepts that we might think are fundamentally the same concept is actually very different in different sort of groups of different social groups, right? Different groups of people. So concepts like freedom and liberty, they don't mean the same thing to a liberal or a conservative. And part of his argument there is that our understanding of politics is really based on metaphors that derive from family. We sort of project our understanding of smaller communities, families and smaller communities, out into the larger social world. And that is how we think about politics. And for those who are more reactionary, more threatened by difference, they tend to have this strict father understanding of the family. And that's what they want to see in a president, someone who just puts people in their place and has everything under control. I mean, that's why, conservative Christians went in droves for Donald Trump. And people who are more open, and maybe it's a little less, divisive to use terms like that rather than liberal and conservative, but they are kind of being defined in specific ways here that I'll get into. People who are less threatened by difference, they tend to understand politics as kind of on a model of a nurturing family, where children have their own personhood and everyone sort of collaborates. So that's just kind of general background. And if you want more sources or information on that, you can feel free to ask, or anything as I go through this presentation here. If you'd like to see the sources, I do have links in this presentation, and I can happily send those links along, or just the presentation if people want it. Feel free to email me later if you still have questions at cstroop@gmail.com. That is fine, and I'll do my best to answer any emails in a timely manner. But anyway, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds there, but that is the theory that informs this presentation. Anyway, as I said, I was a Christian school kid, and it's not really secret. So, I was also raised as a boy. So that is my 4th grade class picture right there. Gotta love those buck teeth, right? And next to a digital picture of a 4th grade writing assignment I wrote called "Why I Believe in Creation" with an A, good job on it. So, as a kid in these Christian schools, you get indoctrinated into all kinds of alternative facts. And as you get a little older, and maybe you read a little stuff that is not from these communities and they don't really want you to read, and you start to have questions, you start to learn that if you're not just repeating what they want to hear, you're really going to get a lot of harsh pushback. Let's go to the next slide. And these kinds of Christian schools, I'm not going to talk too much specifically about Christian schools today, because I want to get into the background of sort of why things happen the way they do in these schools. But I do want to say that, we don't know how many of them exactly are in the United States, but these sort of Protestant evangelical schools, which tend to be very authoritarian, controlling environments where indoctrination takes place, and where most people believe that, there should be male leadership in the family. We know there are about 2,400 of them that are receiving voucher funding that use certain specific curriculum, which was how this Huffington Post report from 2017 tested for this. They did a huge study on which schools used 3 major fundamentalist curricula, Abeka, Bob Jones, and Accelerated Christian Education, or ACE. So that's a lot of kids. And if you think about this over, the number of years and the number of graduates, even if we're talking about some of these schools are very small, some of them are larger, some of them are church schools, some of them have their own campuses, we're still talking about a very, very, very large number of kids who go through these programs where they are taught things like, sexual purity is of paramount importance and must be protected at all costs, especially for girls. They're taught to be submissive to male authority, and not to question anything that is central to the Christian beliefs that they are taught, which includes just a lot of misinformation and, let's say, alternative facts, right? Like young earth creationism, as I showed as an example in the other slide. As an adult, one of the things I learned, I was in college, I think, or maybe just graduated from college, when I was Googling some stuff about, or wouldn't have been Googling at the time, but anyway, about, I don't want to date myself there, about my old Christian school, and found out that one of my history teachers, a guy named Larry Myers, had been arrested for sexual misconduct with minors, and was ultimately convicted, though was given, unfortunately, in my view, very lenient sentencing. And I had no idea this was going on, but it does make sense with broader patterns that we see in evangelical subculture. And of course, it's conservative Christians, by and large, and other right-wingers, right-wing zealots, and ideologues and conspiracy theorists who are screaming groomer these days at queer people, people whose sexuality or gender identity and expression sort of makes them afraid, because these people are fearful of difference. They have a very closed and authoritarian sort of outlook on the world. Everyone needs to be exactly how you're supposed to be. This kind of nuclear family unit, the father knows best, father very much in charge. And when they see things that openly challenge that, they lash out and accuse people of things that they're often doing themselves. It's a way to avoid seeing what's happening in their own communities. And I'm going to give you some examples and also talk about some general points that try to tie all this together. First off, I do want to mention too, this is an article that I published a few years ago at this point, is that they're trying to, and they have been for decades, not only deregulate, but also allow state funding for Christian schools and homeschooling, where these dangerous and damaging attitudes proliferate, these attitudes that foster abuse, that make abuse more likely to occur. They actually used the pandemic in some pretty disgusting ways to recruit people into homeschool communities or Christian schools that radicalize people, including radicalizing parents into using corporal punishment and pushing extreme ideas of sexual purity and so forth. And I'll just read one little quote from a press release from this Christian right advocacy group called Public School Exit that appeared during the pandemic. With coronavirus shutting down government schools, that's what they call public schools, millions of parents have a historic opportunity to try homeschooling and non-government alternatives. just look at that, perfectly matter of fact and actually cheerful language. Yay, we have a pandemic, a social catastrophe. Now we'll get more people into Christian schools and Christian homeschooling environments. Super bizarre. I looked into that at the time, and the people behind this initiative, they claimed it was a new thing, but they were all pretty much associated with the Council for National Policy, which is an authoritarian right-wing lobbying organization, largely consisting of conservative Christians, and that is pretty secretive in its operations, and also the John Birch Society. And if you look at who's in network with whom, there are a lot of connections between the Council for National Policy, which represents kind of the richer, more genteel, more respectable conservatives in these environments, and the John Birch Society, which is, the less respectable, and maybe they want to keep them a little bit at a distance, but they're very much working together. Why do they want to get people into these kinds of schools or into homeschooling environments? Basically, it's about power and control. Of course, we're also aware that right now they're also passing laws in many states to require the posting of the stupid national motto, "In God We Trust," in public schools, or they're trying to require the posting of 10 Commandments. They're putting chaplains in schools in Texas, chaplains that come from organizations that we know don't act like chaplains are supposed to act, which is to be very much centered on the person they're ministering to and not push their religion on them. But these chaplains have an evangelical agenda. They want to convert people. They're also trying to transform public schools into Christian schools, just in case they can't get everyone out of the public schools. But they want public schools to fail. They're so focused on schools because they want to control people as children. And what is grooming if not that? You're socializing people into a kind of pervasively abusive environment and setting them up to perpetuate cycles of abuse of various kinds. So let's pull back for a minute and talk about what this has to do with so-called family values. As I mentioned earlier, it has very much to do with how you imagine the family. And I've got a quotation up here from the great book, Jesus and John Wayne, by Kristen Kobes-Dumais. And I want to give her props because she is a Christian and still broadly evangelical, but one who is honest enough to admit that within the conservative, mostly white evangelical movement overall, there's no contradiction between how they understand family values and supporting Donald Trump. And she says, just right out loud that, the frequency of these instances of abuse and the tendency of evangelicals to diminish or dismiss cases in their own communities suggests that evangelicals' response to allegations of abuse in the era of Trump cannot be explained by political expediency alone. Rather, these tendencies appear to be endemic to the movement itself. So props for honesty there. And then she also notes that evangelical family values have always entailed assumptions about sex and power. The evangelical cult of masculinity links patriarchal power to masculine aggression and sexual desires. Its counterpoint is submissive femininity. She goes on to say that because of purity culture and the way that women are required to avoid even appearing to be available, if a man lusts after them, it's her fault, that this puts them in an impossible position. They're supposed to be submissive to masculine authority, but they're also supposed to be pure. I will say that when it comes to victims who are children, boys are also put into quite an impossible position. And if they were to speak out, not only does it threaten, the reputation of the church, which you're told is very important and you need to protect it, but also, even though they were obviously victims and they were abused, they might be seen as gay, and that is very much a no-no in these environments. So there's kind of no winning here. But with female victims in particular, as Dumais notes in her book, they're often made to reconcile with their abusers, and in church environments where these things are hashed out through elder boards or whatever, and told that they need to apologize for their part. They are represented as seductive, and they might be 10 years old. This happens all the time in evangelical environments. And then I do want to mention that boys are abused in evangelical environments as well. And for anyone who hasn't read Jesus and John Wayne, and if you want to think about how evangelical culture cultivates grooming and abuse, I would highly recommend the book, and especially chapter 16, which is called Evangelical Mulligans, A History, which basically shows how there's this pattern of all these things coming out after being covered up for years, and they are, and basically endless second chances are given out to prominent male leaders in these communities. That has started to change a little bit with survivors and advocates really pushing back, as we've also seen in the Catholic Church, but there's still very much this culture of, protect God's anointed leaders, protect their reputation of the church. And so in one case, this guy named Pete Newman, he worked at the Kanakuk summer camp organization for 14 years. And it's pretty clear that his superiors knew that some very shady things were going on. But until accusations started to come out from boys that he had molested in, I believe it was 2009, around then, he was convicted. He was tried and convicted in 2010. It just went on. It was just business as usual, despite some people being very aware that something really wrong was going on with Newman in this summer camp environment. And I mean, you want to talk about grooming, he was known for taking naked four-wheeler rides with naked teenage boys at the camps and having one-on-one Bible studies in hot tubs. And just to kind of briefly touch on the definition of grooming, when you're grooming someone for abuse, I mean, the ideological environment obviously helps. In this case, protect God's anointed, protect the reputation of the church. These are reasons not to tell, right? So these help to create an environment in which someone may be abused and keep the secret. But also, people who groom children for abuse, they put themselves in positions where they get access to children, and then they kind of lavish attention on certain children to try to make them feel special. Sometimes they get to know the family. Most abusers are indeed known to the families. It's not a stranger danger thing, or they are members of the family. And the more that a community cultivates attitudes of family first, family above all, protect the family, protect the church, protect our reputation, and puts a big shame and stigma on abuse, the less likely kids are to talk about it, at least not sometimes for years after the fact. And all those attitudes are pervasive in conservative Christian communities. But let's take another step back here now, and let's try to abstract some kind of general points that speak to these patterns that I've just been discussing, and then we'll kind of apply them more to evangelical subculture. But first, again, I want to stress that abuse can occur in any social environment, which is why best practices and safeguards are fundamental. And while it's a bit outside the scope to talk a lot about best practices, I mean, I will say, if you are an organization that is employing people, even as volunteers who work with children, it is certainly incumbent on you to do background checks on those people. That's one thing, but also the cultivation of certain attitudes can be considered a part of best practices. So for example, teaching children that they should speak out if they're abused, something that doesn't usually happen in conservative Christian communities. I also want to note that there are different kinds of abuse. We've been focusing a lot on child sex abuse, which is pervasive and particularly a horrible situation that we know often happens in hierarchical religious communities, the Catholic Church, more recently the Southern Baptist Church. But abuse can also be simply physical but not sexual, like corporal punishment, can be psychological. And in conservative religious communities, there's also a category I think it's important to be aware of that we call spiritual abuse. And when I say spiritual abuse, I don't want people to go, wait a minute, you don't have to believe in anything metaphysical. You don't have to believe that spirit is any kind of substance or any kind of thing at all to understand that spiritual abuse is simply a social phenomenon. Spiritual abuse happens when people use their spiritual authority or religious beliefs to control someone. Sometimes that's a part of grooming. Sometimes you do this to keep someone from speaking out about other kinds of abuse that you may be perpetrating on them. But sometimes this can just be simply something like, what happened to me when I was 16 years old and went to talk to a pastor about my doubts. He was very understanding at first. He gave me an apologetics book to read that's defense of the faith. I found it too glib. I went back and told him I was still struggling with doubt. And then he pulled out the the Bible is clearly inerrant, so the problem must be with you. You're probably being influenced by demons. Now, there's an example of controlling, manipulative, and frankly, really scary rhetoric, and that is an example of spiritual abuse apart from physical or sexual abuse. When I talk about spiritual abuse, that's what I mean, and that is pervasive in these kinds of environments. It protects the closed authoritarian community and its authoritarian ideology and its practices of isolating people in these communities, and especially children. Abuse proliferates in conservative and specifically conservative religious institutions, not because there's just something that inherently makes people in those institutions and environments more likely to abuse people, but because of the prevailing practices that are reinforced by an ideology that de facto and or de jure prescribes a strictly enforced social hierarchy, usually patriarchal in nature. I want to point out that why I mentioned de facto and or de jure is that you may have a hierarchy that specifically says, you may have an ideology that specifically says, okay, men are in charge of everything, women cannot be leaders over men, and fathers are the heads of their family, no questions asked, what they say goes, right? Some conservative Christians actually spell out those beliefs. Now, some environments may not spell out those kinds of beliefs, but they still de facto have this very strong, strictly enforced hierarchy. Sometimes we may not be aware of it. And that's something to watch out for, to try to be aware of what are the practices in my communities, what are the ideas that are actually motivating people, but that we don't talk about. Conservative institutions and movements tend to exhibit heightened in-group, out-group consciousness with concomitant animosity toward out-groups and excessive loyalty to unaccountable, often charismatic leaders. I want to unpack that a little bit. Now, in-group, out-group consciousness is a kind of inevitable thing. Human beings divide ourselves into social groups. We all have this identity that comes from some of the groups that we're just thrust into, as we're growing up. And we know, well, I'm in this group, I'm not in that group. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you have such intense in-group, out-group consciousness that you become hostile toward outsiders, that does become a problem. And it can spill over into a kind of paranoia where you're also constantly looking for internal enemies. And as a result of that, you can become abusive, or you project things that are happening in your community. Instead of looking inward, you look outward and you find people to scapegoat, which we'll talk a little bit about that too toward the end of this presentation. An excessive deference to leaders who aren't subject to any accountability checks, that sort of practice and that sort of attitude also contributes to the pervasiveness of abuse in any environment where you have that. So a little bit of this can be hard to avoid, hero worship, role models, that sort of thing. But if we, particularly in the secular community, if we say that we cultivate attitudes of being critical, we don't just take things at face value, then we really need to practice that, and we need to have enough self-awareness to know when we're not. So, if someone that a lot of people in the community look up to, Richard Dawkins, maybe people don't look up to him as much anymore, I hope not, but because he's said a lot of awful things, but if he says something awful, we need to be willing to hold him to account and not just let it go, so deference to kind of charismatic leaders, it's something that does happen in secular communities as well, that we need to be careful of. Next, in environments prone to abuse, people de facto treat the reputation of the institution, movement, or leader as more important than any individual who is harmed. I probably don't need to belabor that one too much. But this next point, I said I would talk a little bit about how we're using liberal and conservative, not necessarily in partisan senses, but kind of in senses in terms of attitudes of openness versus authoritarianism. Even progressive institutions can be conservative in this sense, which is why you never want to be in a situation where people's attitudes are such that, oh, these people are so good, they're moral authorities, I just trust them and I'm not going to question them. So obviously this happens with church leaders, right? Catholic priests, Protestant pastors. People trust youth pastors or Christian school teachers with their kids because they share the same faith, right? And they think they can trust their fellow Christians to be better, morally superior people. And obviously they can't. But sometimes in progressive institutions and progressive communities, we also trust people in ways that we shouldn't. And I'll give you some examples. This was a big thing that happened in the Southern Baptist Church, for example. But actually I did not mean to have this slide next. My apologies. Things got a little bit mixed up here. I want to go to, and I'll come back. I want to go to this slide. On that last point, you know, that progressive institutions can also be conservative in this sense. Here's one that really kind of hit home for me. The charity Mercy Corps, which I used to donate to, turned out its founder, Ellsworth Culver, was abusing his daughter for years. And people in the organization knew that something was going on, but they didn't talk about it. They just let it happen. That's an example of how an institution with liberal or progressive values can also allow abuse to proliferate by simply having too much trust in a charismatic leader. And I do want to point out that, yeah, we have seen this in atheist and secular communities too. I'm not going to belabor the point. Just want to point out, though, that it's very much there. And maybe we'll look at this quote from this article. What is most troubling about the Lawrence Krauss story is how many in the atheist movement knew about his reputation before the BuzzFeed article came out. If secular communities want to provide a better alternative to religious institutions, why didn't anyone confront Krauss sooner? Why are Shermer and Carrier still given a platform despite having similar accusations levied against them? Perhaps it's another sign that people in general are inclined to protect their beloved leaders regardless of religious affiliation. We do want to watch out for that. But anyway, I will now go back to focusing on conservative Christian institutions and specifically the Southern Baptist Church. As just one more example, and then I'll bring this to a conclusion and we can go to Q&A. This report from Guidepost Solutions is the result of an audit that was done in 2021 and 2022 after lots of abuse allegations started emerging in the Southern Baptist Church. The San Antonio Express News and Houston Chronicle did an expose, 700 individual cases, 400 perpetrators that they found in Southern Baptist churches over a period of about just the last 20 years. A really big deal. And it has started conversations in the Southern Baptist world, which is very patriarchal. In fact, women are not allowed to vote at the annual convention where they set the policy. Women are generally not supposed to teach men or have leadership over men. Unsurprisingly, turns out a lot of abuse happens in Southern Baptist churches. And I want to point out that this happened after the period of 1970s to the early 1990s, when a so-called, euphemistically called conservative resurgence occurred in the Southern Baptist Church, which was basically a hostile takeover of the denomination by right-wing reactionaries, so that there was no more room for like a Jimmy Carter-style Southern Baptist in leadership, right? In their seminaries and schools and universities, in their churches. And they started strictly enforcing no female ordination, no leadership of women over men, and promoting what they initially called biblical patriarchy. And then to make it sound nicer, they started calling it complementarianism, but it basically means male headship. The man leads within the family. It is literally a part of their prescribed theology, and a church cannot be a member of the Southern Baptist Convention without subscribing to this ideology that women cannot be leaders over men or equal to men in terms of leadership roles. I mean, they'll say, okay, complementarianism means men and women are equal, but God made them for different and complementary purposes. But we all know that really means men are in charge, and that is very, conducive to abuse. And so this whole thing was organized by two main leaders, Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler. And interestingly enough, what happened to them? Paige Patterson was basically given a golden parachute into a really nice retirement after he just couldn't get away from things that came out about him basically telling women who were abused by their husbands that they should stay in those marriages and just pray for their husbands. And also made some terrible comments about rape, basically telling a woman she had to forgive her assailant and not report the crime to police. That's a common pattern. So that's one of the two main leaders of the conservative resurgence. The other one, credibly accused of molesting boys over many, many years. So I've got those links there for people who want to look more into these cases. But I think it just sort of goes to show, if you've got people really pushing a politics of moral panic, they're probably hiding something. Anyway, if you look at the Southern Baptists as a case study, you can definitely see how all these points apply. And I think we've already pretty much brought that up, how you see these different kinds of abuses and how they sort of feed into each other and create feedback loops. I mean, spiritual abuse, which is a constant sort of backdrop in evangelical institutions, makes people less likely to say anything about the sexual abuse or sexual misconduct. We have the actually de facto in the Southern Baptist institution strictly enforced social hierarchy and the idea of protecting the leader and their reputation more than individuals who are harmed. So all of that applies. And now we'll skip over these slides because we already talked to them, and I apologize for getting those things out of order. One point that I want to stress here, though, in bringing up that progressive or institutions with liberal or progressive values can also be conservative. In terms of habits of mind, I think it's always good to remind ourselves that there are no shortcuts to being a good person. Least of all, right belief. Even if we think that right belief is no belief or right belief is skepticism, if we think that because we are skeptical, we are therefore moral, we're skipping a lot of steps of the actual work that you have to do to be a good person. And again, it does happen sometimes in the secular community as well. And in any case, about the Southern Baptist case again, can they fix the problem? I'm very skeptical about their ability to fix this problem so long as they prescribe a patriarchal hierarchy. They have tried. They passed some fairly toothless resolutions at their big convention last year. They have made a database available of known abusers, and that's a good step, but it took a lot of public pressure. And in fact, during all these years of cover-up and while the public pressure was happening, if you look at that 300-page report, you'll see how the people who were covering it up dismissed the victims of abuse with saying that, oh, this is an attack from the devil. They are trying, the devil is trying to keep us from our mission of spreading the gospel. So spiritual abuse was a big part of it. They still got the complementarian theology. They're also engaged in scapegoating and projection. And by the way, that database that they finally put out, the Southern Baptist leaders argued that because their denomination was so decentralized, and by the way, that's the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, something like about 15 million people, thankfully, finally beginning to lose numbers, but still very large. They said that because the church was so decentralized, they could not keep a database of known abusers. And there was kind of a pattern of people moving around, sort of like in the Catholic Church, but with less of the direct organization because that doesn't exist in the Southern Baptist Church. In fact, leaders did have a list, though. They kept it secretly among themselves. They knew, and they covered it up. But another reason that I think their attempts to fix this are not likely to do a great job is because of how most of their members still persist in these authoritarian attitudes and are scapegoating people and calling others groomers instead of seeing the groomers inside their own house. And I just want to briefly say, we saw a similar moral panic in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's not a coincidence that many of the people who were convicted at that time of supposedly satanic ritual abuse and then were exonerated, turned out that they were queer people. And the QAnon and related conspiracies of today, where they're associating queerness with pedophilia, is basically a repeat of the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. I don't have time to belabor that point, but I wanted to make it, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you like. So that pretty much sums it up. Conservative Christian institutions are prone to abuse, or abuse is pervasive within them, because they prescribe this kind of strict and they prescribe and defend this strict social hierarchy, patriarchal hierarchy, and they have a kind of cult of unaccountable charismatic leaders, and they tend to focus on protecting the institution and its reputation more than any individuals who are harmed. Those are things that can happen outside of conservative Christian institutions as well, which is what I mean when I say that even a liberal or progressive institution can be conservative. And for those of us who support more liberal values, democracy, human rights, I think we need to watch for that in our own institutions and not just pat ourselves on the back and say we're better than these conservative Christians, even if overall we are, which we are. But start thinking about yourself as sort of superior based on being the smartest, or based on whatever. You can set yourself up for an environment where these patterns can repeat, and we don't want to do that. So I just want to end with that warning, and now I'll be happy to engage in questions and discussion.
All right. Well, there are a few comments here. Let's see. So, and some compliments. Excellent analysis. Thank you. Diane points out that Dawkins was also slammed for his comments against women and allowance of mild pedophilia, whatever that is. Let's see. Oh yeah, we've got some events coming up. Thank you for posting those. Here's another comment. I came in late, so this might have been covered earlier, but from what I understand or don't understand, pastors, etc., who do counseling, unlike clinical psychologists or social workers, have no requirements for ethical and professional standards. What can be done about that? That was just a case here in Arizona too. We talked about it.
I mean, that's very important, and that's a great question. I mean, I think that clergy should be included in state laws about mandated reporters of abuse. But anyone can sort of set themselves up and say, "Oh, I offer counseling," and if they're not lying to you and they're not showing a fraudulent credential, I don't know that much can be done about that. I mean, I feel like we should have ways to do some sort of policies. I mean, I know the state of California would probably slap a warning label on it. Maybe that's a good thing. Not many states act like California in that respect. But you've also got a situation, and this happens a lot, where conservative, right-wing, ideologically driven, authoritarian, patriarchal Christians navigate all the things they need to do to get professional certifications, and then they ignore all the best practices in favor of their ideologies. So you might actually have a credentialed counselor in a legitimate program who then doesn't actually follow the best practices of their community. And all you can do then is report them to the APA or whoever, report them to the accrediting bodies and warn people if it happens to you, but you can't catch that in advance. They do have their own credentialing programs though. So you've got to, if someone says, "Oh, I have a credential from whatever," and you haven't heard of it, you've always got to look it up.
Mm-hmm. I just read something recently too about, I don't know what the fake APA is now. The folks the folks who disagree with the actual APA about care for trans kids, but they look legitimate, and somebody in that community posted like, here are some of the organizations you might see that look like they're official, but they're really not.
That's very good to be aware of those. There's a whole lot of them. They try to create their own institutional, sort of parallel set of institutions, so they can basically claim, well, we disagree and we have doctors too, and so who's right? And if they create this sense that, well, oh, it's both sides thing, that gives them enough legitimacy to carry on and lead a lot of people astray, or give a lot of people permission who maybe they don't want to support, for example, their transgender kids. Oh, well, look at the people on our side. Yeah, it's a mess.
Yeah, there's this trend now of school board members and other folks inviting members of Gays Against Groomers. I mean, never mind the fact that Equality Arizona has been around forever, Glisten, 1 in 10, all these great organizations that are actual experts on those kinds of topics and great advocacy groups. Nah, we're going to get Gays Against Groomers. Then we get to also say, look, I have a gay friend, Here's another comment. I hope I say your name right. Emil, perhaps. This is more of a comment. Historical groups of anarcho-syndicalists called this leaderism, the tendency to appoint and obey leaders over the collaborative work of a community of equals. We can learn a lot from anarchists. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, that's leaderism is an interesting term, but that's a good point. Yeah, that sort of that cult of the leader, or if we just put too much trust in them, again, it can be de facto. It doesn't have to be prescribed, and then not apply enough accountability to them, you get yourself into a bad situation.
Another question from John. Victims are reluctant to report abuse because of fear, shame, and the prospect of retribution. So John is asking, how can we help kids to break this culture of silence? ? TikTok info videos ? I think that's a good start. Yeah.
I honestly think that, that could be useful. I don't know where the latest sort of political maneuvering has gone with, are they going to ban TikTok? Are they not going to ban TikTok because it's Chinese or whatever? I haven't followed that closely, but I think TikTok, as far as I know, and I should know more, and I really should learn to use it, but I'm 43, okay? I don't want to. But yeah, it reaches a lot of kids. And so I do think that would be helpful, informative, presentations, wherever you can get a platform that reaches the youth, it'd be good to do that. And if we think that's something that is valuable for secular advocacy, I mean, we should find young people with social media savvy,
And I'm working on it, but even the YouTube videos that I watch to try to figure out how to do TikTok, their instructors are all Gen Z, so they're on their phone okay, so then you do this and then click, and I'm like, wait, pause. I don't know what's happening right now. It makes me feel really, really old, but I'm working on it. This is a good question. This is from Mars. Mars asked, what does it take to require Arizona to teach comprehensive sex ed in public schools? I can answer that. In Arizona, it's a governing board vote. Any governing board can opt in for comprehensive sex ed. When I was on my school board, we did that. Results have been amazing. One thing that I was going to say when you were speaking, Chrissy, was it's just, to me, the fact that they don't have to be mandated reporters, first of all, is just such a huge tell. It's so obvious. It's right in your face. Everybody has to report sex abuse except for you.
Yeah, it depends on the state, but and I don't know off the top of my head the exact numbers, but there are a lot of states where clergy are not mandated reporters because you're supposed to be able to confess to them safely. Well, maybe there's a place for that religious value to a point, but among certain things, I think even priests, confessors, should have a responsibility to keep dangerous people off the streets or hold them accountable. So I think it's outrageous that clergy aren't always considered mandated reporters. And one of the reasons they want to isolate kids in homeschooling or Christian school environments too, is to keep them away from mandated reporters. Now, technically, teachers in Christian schools are mandated reporters, but Christian schools are so unregulated that who's going to check? So
it's true. It's police departments conducting their own investigations whenever there's a shooting of a citizen by police. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And with that case about Larry Myers, my high school history teacher, this I don't 100% know, but it's in the Whisper network, and maybe I shouldn't say it to a whole audience of people, but I have no reason to doubt that people have told me this, so it's probably true, but caveat, it might not be. I was told that leadership at the school basically pressured the family at first not to go to the authorities and tried to just have him join a little accountability group with other male teachers. And obviously it didn't, if that did happen, and that's what the Whisper Network says, it didn't work. Now, if
Yeah.
that didn't happen in that particular case, it's still a very common way of dealing with things in-house in a conservative Christian institution.
Here's one. I'm going to move to the Q&A real quick because there's tons of compliments in the chat. People are now following you on Twitter. They're appreciative of some of the suggestions you've given. Somebody also recommended the podcast Straight White American Jesus because some
That's
of the
a good
people
one.
it's a really good one. And is that Brad Onishi? Is that who that is?
Yeah, and Dan Miller.
Yeah. And yeah, Brad was here a little while back too. So yeah, we've got some great guests, and Lindsay put up the YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and watch some of these talks, sometimes they're depressing. You might want to have a cold beverage in your hand. But I want to go to Q&A real quick so these folks don't feel ignored. He's asking specifically, this is Peter, he's asking specifically about the Catholic Church. And he asks, does your research on abuse include sexual abuse by Catholic priests and brothers? And does the continued existence of celibacy lead to such abuse?
Now, I haven't done any, let's say, original research into that question. I have, done my fair share of reading on the topic. And I will say that I think that in environments where people repress their sexuality and are required to repress their sexuality, Freud was a terrible misogynist and he was wrong about a lot of things, but he wasn't wrong about everything. Repression does tend to lead to a sort of return of the oppressed in a more malignant and distorted form. So I don't want to say that it's necessarily like, A plus B equals C sort of way that celibacy will lead to people being abusive in their sexuality, but I think celibacy is one component, along with the broader, anti-sex ideology that you have in these environments. It does kind of just warp people's sexual attitudes, and it can be done in dangerous ways, because one thing that's common across conservative Christian environments is a lack of emphasis on bodily autonomy and consent. And in fact, you'll still find if you push them a little bit, there are still many conservative Christians who will say that they don't think marital rape should be a thing, because when you're married, a man should have access to his wife. And there aren't as many who will say that out loud as there used to be, but there are some.
I'm sure, and I know that Hamet Mehta, he always posts little screenshots of the transformed wife, and she essentially says, yeah, you have a duty and an obligation to do nothing but dote on your husband and give him sex whenever he wants, even if you don't want. It's really, really gross.
And one thing about this stuff that, it's terrible, but one thing that kind of cracks me up is that they think that it's like, this is the eternal order of things. This is the family as instituted by God, and it's always been this way. And this is all just actually really Victorian norms, retrofitted to make the Bible fit them, because the Bible has a whole lot of different models of, family going on in it, right? Like, I'm sure, don't have to belabor that point in the secular community.
It's like Game of Thrones up in there.
Yeah, pretty much.
Complete with magic, So here's a question from Emil. Would you talk a little bit about the potential work that youth liberation ideas and movements can do to help dismantle these secular and religious authoritarian structures?
That's a great question. And I will say that in a seemingly, very dark time, even though most Americans don't agree with the repressive policies that are being pushed largely by the Republican Party, but they're still very successfully pushing them because of disproportionate power that they have through our structures and stacking the Supreme Court. The kids do give me hope. Gen Z being the most non-religious generation, I do think that's a good thing. Not in a let's pat ourselves on the back, we're so smart sort of way. But I think they're also very different, though, from the old sort of cult of Dawkins style atheists in their non-religion. They're sort of much more. They're less prone to just accept things from from leaders without questioning them. They're organizing school walkouts against gun violence and other things in different states, standing up for queer rights, and they want to, as we know from surveys that have been done, they want to see secular advocates do more for LGBTQ rights. I think that's great, and I think that should be encouraged. I love Secular Students of America as a great, youth organization in our community. I think they're doing great work, and all I can say is, yeah, more outreach, more encouragement, however we can do it in our local communities. I think one thing that, those of us who are a bit older can do is, like you do, Jeannie, is show up for the school board, yeah.
It takes a strong stomach to do it. I'm actually in the middle of writing another Substack from the last night Peoria Unified School Board meeting. It was a mess. As a matter of fact, if you want to torture yourself, here's the link to the board meeting from the other night, because I just couldn't. I feel like I lose IQ points sometimes when I go to these meetings every time I go. There's a ton of hilarious there's a ton of hilarious comments in here. There's a whole thing of, there's all these like metaphors about what like girls who aren't virgins are equated to a used piece of gum. Thank you, mom and dad, for not raising me in the church. I appreciate you. There's another one about the rose with all the petals torn off. And then somebody says, what's the analogy for boys who aren't virgins? And
there's not really, I mean,
no, right?
I mean, technically you can be a chewed up piece of gum too if you're a boy, I guess. They just don't really push it as hard with the boys. I mean, they do, but they also tell the boys that, oh, you are all lust monsters, and you want to make sure you help the girls stay modest and not tempt you. So
well, and that's how they justify like trying to reverse these bathroom policies and these trans care plans that schools quietly did 5 years ago, because they were like, we better get in alignment with the law. That's what school districts did. Now they've got these mega moms coming in and saying, we need to, reverse this policy. And it's all because they just assume that men can't control themselves, because they aren't talking about trans women. They're talking about cisgendered men, like, straight men, being the perpetrators. It's incredible. Like I said, take your blood pressure medication, maybe bring a flask with you, because it's really hard to sit through those meetings. It really is.
Yeah.
There's discussion.
In terms of school board fights, I'm going to drop a link in the chat too, where I talked to some people who were involved with a school board fight in California, and the whole sort of surrounding brouhaha there of in Placer County, California, where there have been sustained attacks from some of these right-wing groups like Moms for Liberty, and then a more local one. I'm trying to remember exactly what it's called. It's in this article, which I wrote, so I should remember what it's called, but I think they're the American Counselors. I mean, they all have such generic names, but
yeah.
Anyway, they went after this church that hosts a youth group that is actually a secular youth group for queer youth, which is a great thing that this church is doing. And this United Church of Christ, very liberal pastor is giving queer kids a support group. And so they've been getting attacked, and it all spilled over into school board meetings and Proud Boys and everything else. If people want to look into that case, there's an article for you. That's one of my rare reported pieces. I mostly write commentary. But once in a while, I do a deep dive, like investigative report.
I clicked on that link, and I'm going to put it in our Facebook chat so folks in Facebook land have it as well. Well, it is 1 o'clock. There's one more question, and then I want you to give us some hope, or tell us what you do to unplug from the trolls that you encounter on Twitter all the time. But the last question before that is, have you done any studies specifically on Mormons?
Again, no. I've just kind of, read and watched documentaries as like a sort of interested observer. So yeah, I really haven't done anything specifically on Mormons, but I've been very interested in listening to ex-Mormons like Matthew Sheffield, who is on Twitter, and there's this podcast, the what's it called? Oh gosh, why am I sorry? How to Heretic, that's what it's called. I'm not sure they're still producing new episodes, but the hosts are ex-Mormons. They're wonderful. And they talk to a lot of ex-Mormons and people from other strict religious backgrounds as well.
There's super
fun.
Yeah,
people.
somebody else is pointing out Mormon Stories podcast. And then I've listened to a podcast in the past called Latter-day Lesbians. And that's a fun podcast. One of the women, they're a couple, and one of the women is not Mormon. The other one was devout Mormon, I believe, even in like Salt Lake City. But had like 6 kids or something like that, kind of just repressed her sexuality and then came out, and they talk about that experience, and they talk about some of the weird things that they do. And here in Arizona, we're always curious about Mormons because, and I don't know if it's still this way, because I'm guessing it's probably somewhere in Idaho now is the second largest capital, but it's Salt Lake City, then Mesa, Arizona. So we have a ton of Mormons here, and we have a ton of ex-Mormons who, came to our group. Yeah. So yeah, what's the thing that you do? Because this is Friday, this is heavy stuff. It's heavy every Friday. What do you do to unravel, unwind after a day of dealing with the Twitter trolls?
Well, I should say, just in the interest of being perfectly honest, is that I have not spent nearly as much time on Twitter since Elon Musk took it over. It kind of sucks now, but I still do promote my work there and sometimes interact, and I still have positive interactions with certain communities on Twitter that I appreciate, kind of overlapping advocacy activists and just intellectual interest sort of communities. But I have taken time off, and I think that can be a self-care thing too, from spending so much time on social media. I always make sure to just keep my sense of humor, try to laugh in the dark times and spaces. And if I, need some help with that, I'll watch some comedy or whatever, or just kick back with, I watch some trashy TV sometimes, I still play video games. I was one of those adults who picked up Animal Crossing during the pandemic. It was so cute and just relaxing,
I know, and I have friends who game, and I'm not much like, I feel like every time I try to game, I'm that person that just keeps running up against a wall because I can't figure out the controls. So the extent of my gaming is like Wordle and the mini New York Times. Like I used to play Words with Friends. My friend Joyce is actually on this webinar right now, but at one point I had like 39 games going, so I had to uninstall it from my phone. So.
Yeah, I do enjoy word games too, and I sometimes, install, uninstall, whatever, but word games are fun. Yeah, and just, time with the dog, time with people that you care about, and noticing and kind of just taking some time to dwell on the things in the news that do kind of lift you up a little bit, like seeing today's youth mostly just really rejecting all the bullshit that's being forced on the country right now. That does give me hope. Every story about a youth protest or whatever, something along those lines is something that I find hope in.
We actually had, I think he may have even set a record as the youngest elected official ever in Arizona, or he's very close, because in 2020, there was a young man who was like 18-ish years old who got elected in the Tempe Union High School District. Armando Montero, I think is his name. And then in this past election cycle, Marcos Siniceros is his name. He was still a senior in high school when he won his election, but he is 18. So he just graduated. Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Jeez,
so like,
that's amazing.
And in Mesa Public Schools, I'm going to give a call out to the folks here in Mesa, because Jacob Martinez, who is another very young man, lost his election for the school board, but somebody stepped down and there's an appointment. So there's a whole thing. I don't have time to put the link, but I'm going to write that down so I put it in our newsletter, because if you are in Mesa, you can encourage the Maricopa County School Superintendent and the board at the Mesa Public Schools to, to get this young man who is actually a product of Mesa Public Schools in there. So that gives me hope. You're right. The youth, Gen Z, they give me hope, and you give me hope. I really appreciate you joining us. And I know that you'll be willing to come back again, and we're going to follow absolutely everything that you do.
Anytime. Thanks so much, Jeannie. You have a great group here, and I always enjoy chatting with you and interacting with the group.
Same. All right, everybody, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.